We're going to discuss during this show what makes for stupendous statements of purpose or impressive MBA essays, because our guest and recent addition to Accepted's family is an expert at both. But for some of you, her main claim to fame may be her status as a Harvard PhD student. How did she do it? Let's find out. Welcome to the 328th episode of Admission Straight Talk, Accepted's podcast dedicated to graduate admissions and helping you approach the application process thoughtfully and successfully. I'm Linda Abraham, the founder of Accepted and the host of this podcast. My mission and passion is to help you show that you both fit in at your target schools and are a standout in the applicant pool. The result? You get a message one day that causes you to jump up and down shouting, "Yes, I'm in!" And not only in, but in at the best program for you. Now, before we get to our interview, I'd like to invite you to Accepted's event with Columbia Business School. Join Michael Robinson, Director of Admissions at CBS, and me for an Ask Me Anything session. This live webinar will start with a very short presentation by Michael, but most of the session will be devoted to Michael answering your questions. Reserve your seat ASAP at accepted.com/328AMA. Our guest today, Rachel Slutsky, earned her bachelor's in English Lit and Jewish Studies from Yeshiva University, her master's in Judaic Study from the University of Chicago, and is currently pursuing her PhD in Religion and Religious Studies at Harvard University. Since her days as an undergrad, she has worked as a writing tutor and teacher, application essay editor, and admissions consultant, and she has also edited for the prestigious Harvard Theological Review. Needless to say, she knows a ton about the writing required of successful graduate school applicants and students, and she's going to share that insight with us today. Rachel, welcome to Admission Straight Talk.
Thank you so much, Linda. This is great to be here.
Delighted that you can join me. Now, can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, how did you come to pursue the academic path that you are pursuing?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm getting a PhD in religion, and growing up, I'm from the Boston area. I went to school and had religious study courses and had a high school teacher who really inspired me. And she was a great, student, a great teacher for me as a student. And I really saw myself trying to kind of be her. And so I went to college thinking I would be a high school teacher for religious studies. And then when I was in my first year, I took a class with a professor who was very demanding and interestingly reminded me a lot of this high school teacher.
Really?
And I wrote to the high school teacher who had gone to my now alma mater. And I said, is there any weird chance that she was there when you were there? And she said, that's the professor that made me want to teach. And
wow, what a story.
It was wild. So she now, the high school teacher is now a professor in her own right. And I'm working on my PhD. So ultimately, I switched my goal to be doing similar content, but on a college level or graduate school level.
Apparently she did too at some point.
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And were they teaching also religious studies or Judaic studies at the time? Both these teachers?
Just very rigorous. Both of them did. Yeah. So it was, we had both been religious studies majors.
Okay. Now you are in a fully funded PhD program in religion and religious studies at Harvard. Getting into a Harvard PhD program is something many people would give their eye teeth to do. How did you do it?
Thank you. Well, obviously, I have to admit that there's always some piece of luck to it. There's also, I think there's luck, there's persistence, and there's actual skill. So the luck part, I can't speak to. I got lucky with an admissions committee. The persistence part is that I applied to be a Harvard undergraduate in my senior year of high school, and I did not get accepted. And I wasn't, too distraught about this. But I realized and actually wanted to be strategic that, I really felt like I could have succeeded at Harvard, and I'd be interested in maybe still going there one day for some other degree. And actually with Harvard, I believe they have a policy, which they started, I think, when I was in high school, of the third shot is the final one. that you're only allowed to submit an application to Harvard of any sort 3 times in your life, because they were
Really?
getting like lifetime
Yeah,
inundations.
yeah.
So I decided actually for my applying to master's programs not to apply to Harvard specifically. I said, don't want to give this up. At that point, I knew I wanted a PhD afterwards. And then I applied for the PhD and got in. So I suppose there was a little bit of skill there, but also just persistence, of wanting to try again. And then the real skill part, I think, was being able to honestly evaluate myself. Because looking back, I think there was no way, even though now I look back and say I would have been okay as a Harvard undergrad and enjoyed my time here, I did not present an application that would have communicated that. And I think I wasn't totally realistic with myself that, did I have the right number of extracurriculars complementing my coursework and the elite grades, and were my essays properly done? I wasn't thinking about it in any kind of complex way at the time. And it was only by the end of college, having done actually a lot of writing tutoring, I was also an English major as well, that I felt like, oh, wait, now I understand what it means to apply somewhere. And so
Apply
now I
well.
look back and apply well. Yes.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, I think it was only after college that I could have gotten into Harvard for college.
Right. It makes sense. And
Yeah.
what do you think? All right. So you talked about the persistence. You talked about an understanding of what a successful application to Harvard means. On the PhD level, what were some of the skill elements, not just the persistence, that you
Hmm.
think contributed to your getting accepted there?
Sure. In terms of the application specifically, I think number one, it involves tailoring the application. That, this cannot be a common app for, and the truth is, I think even for college students, that they have to also figure out a way that even throughout the common application process, they still stick out, that they are not common.
Right.
Um, and I think that's really important. It is in a sense a performance, and it means being willing to, again, not exaggerate, never to tell a lie, but to really kind of like, you're putting on your best outfit and your best face and you're going forward. And in that sense, I work with a lot of clients who I think have a hard time talking about themselves. I think many of us do. And being able to say, I accomplished X, Y, and Z, or I won this much, funding or money because of, my hard work. Talking about those things, is really important. And this is your time to kind of show off, in a sense. If there's one time where you should be showing what you have to give, I think it's
Right.
in an application. Um, the one other thing is, I think with applications, every part needs to complement the other part. And that's another thing where I did not understand. I was sitting in on a webinar this morning actually about CVs and resumes, and they're talking about resumes and cover letters in this, the last portion of it. And they said, everyone repeats the same thing, that they think the cover letter is a letter form of a resume. And it was, even for me, it was all really helpful to reinforce, like, there are a reason these different kind of genres exist, that the cover letter serves a different function than the resume. And your list of grades does one thing and your scores do another thing
That's
for
right.
standardized exams. That your recommendations are not just supposed to be speaking to, yep, I gave her a 98 because she's was worth a 98 at the end, right? That they should
They
add
know
more
that.
than,
They know that already.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually easy to forget that, redundancy is not what the admissions committee is looking for.
No, absolutely. Now, in addition to getting into Harvard, you've received over $50,000, in a fully funded PhD, I should add. In addition to that funding, you've received over $50,000 in funding outside of the fully funded PhD. How did you manage that?
I stole all of it. No, no, that would take some real skill. Um, so some of it was, again, I do have to credit luck. For example, my master's degree ended up being fully funded. I was not expecting that. I was fully prepared that I was going to take out loans and pay off my master's degree over time. And when I got accepted to the University of Chicago, there were two documents that came up when it said, you have mail, and one of them was saying I was accepted, and I almost didn't open the second. I thought it was like, time to sign your health insurance waivers. And a friend of mine was with me, and she was like, open that one up too. And it turned out that they said, you've won such and such a fellowship, which we give to an incoming student with a specialty in this subject in Jewish studies, and therefore we're going to cover your tuition and give you a stipend.
Wow.
So it was really exciting and truly unexpected. I would say, just like with applications for graduate school or college, applications for grants is really, it's always a great way to also practice applying. Um, and it's a good way to learn about tolerating both rejection and getting excited about acceptance. I had a mentor, a professor in college, who I applied for some kind of grant during college and I didn't get it. And I told him how disappointed I was. And he said that some of the best advice he ever got was, if you're getting accepted or getting the money from every grant you apply to, you're clearly not applying to enough. Um, so I try to think of that now whenever I get rejected from something, and now it's normal that I apply for funding almost every semester for different projects and travel and conferences, and sometimes I get it and sometimes I don't, and that's okay.
Rebecca Lippman, and we'll link to the interview that I did with her, is a specialist in funding. She works at the UCLA Scholarship Center as well as at Accepted. And she said, her big thing is you have to just keep applying. You have to have a regular schedule of applying, researching, etc. That was one of her big takeaways from the interview with her. And again, I will link to it. I don't have the number offhand, but I'll definitely link to it. Yeah. Okay. You recently joined Accepted as a consultant after years as a writing tutor, admissions consultant, and even editor of the prestigious Harvard Theological Review. And in your Accepted bio, you wrote, one of the most remarkable parts of my job is helping my clients to find their own voices and tell authentic narratives about themselves. How do you help them tell those authentic narratives? What advice would you give somebody listening to this podcast in terms of helping them find their authentic voice and tell that narrative?
Well, I think sometimes when you're thinking about, oh, I have to, again, put my best foot forward, this is my one chance, to prove myself to Harvard, we can get so lost in that mindset that it becomes very inauthentic. It's, what do I think they want to hear? And before you know it, it really, time and time again, I only see applications that are poor when they've been done in that mindset. When it's really trying to be, I think what they want is X, I'll try to please them. And I think finding kind of an authentic voice and authentic narrative, and I try to do this with my clients, is to say, slow down and just tell me, you're not writing this isn't for an application, but just talk out loud. And I think they can do it even to themselves out loud. Tell me why you're passionate about this. Tell me what you want, to get out of this degree, or what got you interested in microbiology. And all of a sudden, all of these stories and narratives come out because they're not concerned about putting on a show. And that's when there's an authentic narrative and an authentic voice coming through. And then, of course, I have to say, as I learned being tutored myself as a college student, write that down. You have to read that. That's such a good point. Write that down.
Right. One of Rebecca, I'll quote Rebecca again. She says, take out your phone and record it.
Definitely. Yeah, I think if I'm happy there aren't, secret cameras, as far as I know, installed in my apartment, because I talk out loud to myself a
lot. Okay. How should the statement of purpose differ for graduate school differ from the undergraduate personal statement? Obviously, you learned a lot from that process, both the success and the failure. I don't know what's going on outside, but I'll mute myself in a minute. What, you know, what are some of the differences? Because I think it's also sometimes something that graduate school applicants in particular get wrong.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the big differences is college applications, they're not expecting that you can demonstrate expertise. And there could be the rare situation in which, you want to go into kinesiology and, you happen to be an Olympian. And those cases are lovely and very few and far between. Um, and applying to master's programs, really any kind of program, MBA, PhD, I think you want to demonstrate some level of expertise. I get what's going on in the field. I've done my homework for 4 years of it. I see myself developing some kind of career out of this. And I don't think the expectation is, that you need to be, you need to be driven to apply to college, but not necessarily career driven. And I think you could have an application, that says, I've always wanted to be a doctor, and therefore I'm hoping to study biology, as a freshman. But ultimately, I think it's more looking backwards and the kinds of, aspects of yourself that you will take with you, and not as much looking forwards. And for grad school apps, I think you have to be kind of in the know enough and demonstrate, like, I understand what is required of me in order to pursue a career as an academic in religion, or, as a journalist or whatever you want to go into. You're still silenced.
Thank you. I agree with you. I think that's the biggest difference, that the college student is not expected to know what they want to do or where they're going to take their education. The graduate student is expected to have some direction and know what they're going to want to do with this education that they intend to pursue.
Right.
And the other things I think that you mentioned are also true, but that to me is the biggest difference. Now, you recently worked with applicants who are in the process of separating from the military, or recently separated from the military, and they're now applying to college and graduate school. What are some of the distinctive challenges that they face, and how do you recommend they overcome them?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges they face is actually one they pose to themselves. I think there's a lot of anxiety about, would I even get accepted to college? I'm such an unusual candidate. Usually I'm unusual in all the wrong ways. I've been in the military for 7 or 10 years. That means I've been, out of school, and my writing might be poor, and my skills are probably, forgotten or not finely honed. And, I'm the wrong candidate for this. And I think it's really like changing perspective, because I think they're very attractive candidates, again, if they can, kind of tell a narrative about themselves and see college as a natural progression. Many of them have demonstrated immense maturity, often bravery in choosing to pursue a military career. And often, their military career has required them to develop all sorts of skills and expertise that really can be spoken about in a very compelling way in an essay. So I think it's not overlooking that they actually have a lot of very good things going for them. And I think also not that military vets should not overlook, I think, the fact that they're often taking advantage of the GI Bill to fund their education, and not everyone is doing that. Not all of their veteran peers are immediately going to college or ever do. Some of them, don't at all. And in that sense, also, I think some of them have a really deep appreciation for education. They realize that kind of their country is thanking them by giving them the gift of education. And in that sense, also, like, they know they want this. It's not that, your parent in senior year says, you got to go to college because I went to college. They've really thought long and hard about this and want to make this life choice.
Right. I was recently interviewed by John Byrne on Poets and Quants for a webinar who should apply to Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton business schools. And the last question, I believe it was the last question he posed, was from somebody in the military. And he basically was saying, outside of leadership, what should we mention? And I said, leadership is one of the biggest things that people coming from the military have. It shouldn't be outside, it should be central.
Mm,
You
yeah,
know,
I,
they have
I can.
incredible leadership experience, incredible responsibilities. So,
And I would say that leadership paired with extreme discipline
yes.
is also attractive. There was a military vet I was talking to who was wonderful, and he'd already started to take some college courses. He'd been in the military for about 20 years. So
Oh,
as
wow.
much as so as much as he kind of struggled, I think, with, how am I qualified to go back to
Yeah.
school? He was also, kind of had really grown as a human being. And he one time said, semi seriously, I don't understand all these college kids, they're coming in late to class, they overslept and they partied the night before, and, they just wander in. And I'm there, like in the front of the class, first thing in the morning, and it bothers me. So I actually approached the professor and asked her if she would please lock the classroom door when class started.
That would shock a whole bunch of students.
Totally. I was like, that is not how it is done. But, I think I understood he had a point that he really valued a
Yeah.
level of discipline that, when you're 18, I don't think any of us do.
Yeah. We had a client, this was years and years ago, probably in the 1990s still. And this guy was applying to an Ivy League law school after 20 years in the military. And he had been an officer. He'd, troops in Iraq, managed, handled, led troops in Iraq. He had risen pretty high in the military, and he was applying to law school. He was probably in early 40s, I would guess. And he was waitlisted, even though his stats, I don't remember that much about his stats, but I think that wasn't the issue. I think they were more concerned about his age and just
Hmm.
fitting in. Again, it was 20 years ago, but what I do remember very clearly is that he told us, in other words, the consultant he was working with and me, that this either he'd spoken to the representative of the school or he'd gotten a letter basically implying that he really hadn't handled much responsibility. And this guy went ballistic.
Oh
Okay.
no.
He went ballistic. He wrote this ripping response. We toned it down a little bit. Okay. Basically saying, I may not have led this, the frats fundraiser or party or, membership drive, but I've led 10,000 troops in combat. I've handled X millions of dollars worth of equipment. I mean, he just went to town. Okay. He got in. Yeah, just,
Wow.
it was one of those letters that you do not forget. It was, and he
No,
was right.
no.
He was right. I mean, plus the person he was talking to had been was a young admissions officer, probably late 20s, and he was he was not. He just went to town on it, and like I said, he got in. He was right.
That's wild.
Um, Now you've worked with applicants across a broad range. Whoa, what was that? Broad range of specialties, and as a writing tutor and admissions consultant. What are some of the differences that applicants should be aware of, let's say, between an academic master's, like what you pursued at the University of Chicago, and a professional master's, like an MBA?
Well, again, I think, if you want to go into academia, you're pursuing a career, you want your master's to lead into some kind of PhD. Again, it could be slightly different in the sciences, right? You can get a master's and a PhD and go into industry, work in a lab. If it's more humanities centered, I think in either case, you're demonstrating research that you've done, maybe original work that you've done, your ability to kind of think very deeply and theoretically about things. With an MBA, for example, you definitely want to show that you have career goals that apply to the quote unquote real world. And I have to admit, I actually always resent the distinction of, the real world and whatever is not the real world. I think I live
Academia.
in the real world. Yeah.
Academia. Yeah.
So, I like to think that academia, like anywhere else, is a pocket of the real world. But in this sense, the division is very effective. I hate admitting that.
I actually remember my first quarter in my business school. We had what we called the nucleus is what it was officially called. We just had all kinds of other names for it. But our teacher, at one point we were sitting in a circle. It was very, PC, encourage, communication, conversation, sitting in a circle, and everybody was referring to the real world, the real world, the real world. And finally, the professor, who was an older woman, stopped us and said, "Wait a minute, this is the real world. I'm real."
Right, exactly. And I do think there can be almost something disparaging when we, talk about what we do as if it's not the real world. We want to think we all have an impact. But on some
Go back
concrete
to your
level,
question, yeah.
yeah, there's, an MBA applicant is talking about like, I'm working in X company, or I want to bring these skills back. The vast majority of people with MBAs do not become business school professors. Some do, and even most of those have had careers in industry as well. And that's a big difference. So I think it's a lot of that kind of real world experience. In some ways, I find that can produce, if MBA applicants spend the time on it, sometimes it can produce sometimes more interesting and readable personal statements, because it's very autobiographical, right? It's about, how my experience, seeing the inside of how Amazon works has influenced what I want to do, or working for this small company in France has contributed to my understanding of X and makes me want to eventually work for this kind of company and in this kind of role. And sometimes I think with academic applications, there's some narrative, but also it's really thinking deeply and demonstrating, proving your ability to do so, that I can think deeply, and I worked on a research project with Professor X, and so I would say those are some of the differences.
What about the differences well, actually, before I get to that question, now, if you talk about applying to business school, for example, or master's engineering programs, or medical school, even law school today, it's graduates are pretty much assured a job and a profession that will, at some point in time, pay off the cost of the education that they've received. If you are applying to masters or PhDs in the humanities, you don't always have that assurance, right?
Yeah.
How do you advise applicants considering applying to masters in areas that might be very interesting to them? They might love the field, whether it's medieval history of any culture, or religious studies.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite a bit of risk involved in that.
Yeah. A family friend who's in college currently asked me yesterday, actually. He said his passion is religious studies, and he'd actually like to be a scholar and get a PhD. But his father, all his siblings happen to be doctors, and he's actually pre-med. He's like set up for that career path as well.
Yeah.
And he was asking kind of, how do you choose? And it's a tough one. I think there's a lot of rhetoric in the academy right now among my peers and professors about a job shortage, and that being a real concern, that there's only so many professors needed, and twice as many or three times as many doctoral students being produced. But I mean, I think it's a combination of having to stay practical and pursue what you're passionate about. And I think, if everyone says there's only a few philosophy professor jobs, it's a waste of time, then there will eventually be no philosophy professors, right? Someone has to be kind of taking the risk. But I also think everyone needs to have some kind of savvy side plan or a job alternative, and they're developing skills for that as well while they work on their academic careers. So for me, it's admissions counseling, it's writing and editing. These are things that I love and I'm happy doing, and I could see myself doing even more than I do now, if this didn't the PhD career didn't pan out. I'm still, investing a lot of my time to try and basically write a book length dissertation so I do get a job. Um, but I do think, yeah, having some other skills in your back pocket is really important.
Okay, great. What about differences between, let's say, applying to an MA program, master's program, and a PhD program? What are some of the differences you see there, both in terms of the decision whether to invest in the program, because obviously the PhD is much, much longer and more expensive, um, and in terms of putting forth an effective application?
Hmm. So I'll make a note on the investment aspect. My experience has been, and again, I'm just talking about humanities PhDs in the
Right.
United States, that those are often funded. Now, not always. Sometimes there's a really heavy teaching load. It varies. So it's just something to think about, that, there's kind of a joke slash truthful statement that the real money for universities comes in with the master's students, right? That usually you're not getting fully funded masters. There might even be little scholarship money, so it's mostly loans, and that you're eventually paying back.
Right.
Um, so yeah, so in that sense, I mean, some people debate about, is it worth it to apply straight out of college for a PhD? If I know I might want a career in academia, I don't think it hurts to do that. And I think there are different people who are sometimes more ready. They know what they would want to write about. They've really, you know, I had kind of a vicious but helpful lecture at me from a professor when I was trying to debate, should I apply straight out of college to a PhD program or not? And there was another student in the school who I knew had applied to Princeton straight out of college and gotten in. And I said, for a PhD. So I said, maybe I can do what he did. And the professor, said, do you know how many languages he learned on his own? And do you know how many, papers he's had published in books? And, I mean, I couldn't compete with that. I just was not there. And in that sense, like, I applied. And my personal story, I think, is actually very illustrative of what you're asking, because I ended up applying to a handful of master's programs and 2 PhD programs. And I got into a number of the master's programs and neither of the PhD programs. And I definitely think it was that these programs were smart and they could totally see, she looks like she's on the track to a career in academia and she's not an expert yet. Which is right where I was. And I think taking the time for a 1 or 2 years master's degree to build expertise is a great transition to being prepared for doctoral work. So I think that's one of the functions and differences of a master's degree as opposed to a PhD.
And what are some differences in terms of the actual application? I mean, is the I assume the PhD applicant, the successful PhD applicant, has to show much more insight into the process, obviously more research, um, perhaps a clearer sense of direction through the program. Is that all true?
I think so, and showing increased specialization.
Yeah.
Going into a master's program, you're coming out of college, so hopefully you have, the credentials to say, I took courses in this, I did some, an independent study in this, I'm super interested, and I have some ideas. That I find interesting. And I think a doctoral application, you don't have to promise, I know what I want to write my whole dissertation on. Here it is. But I think you do have, this was advice I got, and I think it really helped me, which was that kind of application needs to show that you are thinking on the level of someone already writing a dissertation, that you have some topics in mind, that you are an expert enough to say, I could see myself writing about, in my case, whatever, this ancient book and these kinds of commentaries and how they interact with one another. And those are things I couldn't have articulated before
Right.
doing a master's degree.
I recently read the memoirs, and I'm forgetting his full name. He was at Princeton for years. He's from England. He was a specialist in the Near East.
Hmm.
I think his last name was Lewis.
Okay.
He was
Oh,
well
Bernard
known.
Lewis.
Bernard Lewis, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, he was very well known. And he passed away, I think, in the last 2 years at 102 or something like that. And
Wow.
his memoirs, by the way, were very good. I thoroughly enjoyed them. But
Wow.
at one point in there, he said somebody came and applied to his PhD program at Princeton. And he said, "What do you want to research?" He says, "I want to prove that country X is entitled to a very small piece of land." This small piece of land, and he didn't say which country or which piece of land. Two countries, this piece of land was disputed between two countries, and they both claimed it. And he felt that one was entitled, this applicant felt that one was entitled and one wasn't. And so he wanted to do research that would prove that the country he felt was entitled to it could get that piece of land. And Dr. Lewis asked him, what if your research shows that the other country is really the one that has the strongest claim? He says, well, that won't happen. He says, how do you know it won't happen? He said, everybody knows it belongs to the first country. And Dr. Lewis just said he didn't have the open mind for
Hmm.
research, and he was not accepted to the program.
Hmm. I think it's true. You're reminding me of a student I worked with when I was working as a tutor in the college writing center.
Mm-hmm.
In my undergrad school, there was a woman who was a student, I think my year, who was in a journalism class, and they were analyzing the phenomenon of bias in reporting. And she came and she similarly said, I need to prove that, again, as everyone knows, a certain newspaper is, bigoted against this group of people or that group of people. And I said, well, we're going to have to kind of weigh the evidence, and we're going to have to really, like, bring some examples to prove this. And, the idea of having to weigh evidence and
Yeah.
challenge her opinion was,
Assumptions.
I'm not, yeah, it was really like kind of too much. So yeah, I think that's another thing, is I think you have to be ready to completely kind of challenge everything, because I mean, if you don't, someone will.
Right.
Every published book has, all these sorts of glowing, recommendations for it, and also, tons of criticism. Everyone in the not real world that I live in, if professors argue as if it's, of a physical consequence.
Right. What do applicants frequently just not understand about the grad school admissions process that they should really grasp before they start applying?
Hmm. Well, I think, hmm, this one is always kind of a tough one. I think something to me that people often don't understand, and which, again, drawing on my own experience, I didn't understand when applying to undergrad, is, like the SAT, like the GRE, it's not actually just, oh, the SAT is truly a measurement of who you are as a person, and however you do is an immediate correlation.
Yeah.
The SAT, right, is its own test, and you have to learn certain skills in order to be good at that thing. Um, and I think applications are similar. It's not simply, if I'm smart, I'll get in, or if I write well, I'll get in, or if I have a good recommender. It's really all of these things together, and understanding, there's a certain way for this to be constructed. I mean, that's where I think admissions consulting is so helpful, is because often those are unwritten rules. And often the expectations are just, they're vague, they're unclear. And I think colleges often want to see kind of, can you figure out how to, can you figure out how to take the SAT? Can you figure out how to apply? And then there are systems in place if you seek them out. To do that. And whether universities should be in some ways as vague as they are about this is maybe a different question, but I
Yeah.
do think part of it is demonstrating. I know what you mean when you ask me, in some personal statement question, what my goals are and why this degree would help me get them or achieve them. Like, if you read that question kind of and understand what it's demanding of you, it shows not only, oh, now the university actually learns about what your goals are, but okay, they got the question.
Right. They got the
So
question. They
so
did
I
the
think if there can
research.
be, some advice in all of that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
no, go ahead. That they got the question. They did the research about the school to understand the school's values also. And then
Hmm.
they can tie what they're looking for to what the school's looking for. The application is supposed to be the bridge
Exactly.
between the two, right?
Totally. I totally agree. And I mean, in that sense, also, I think this is also a difference I didn't mention with college admissions versus graduate admissions is, going into college, you're not expected on your application to have done your research to the extent that looked up every professor in the English department and know who you'd like to do some work with. Right here, that's usually going a little bit above and beyond, I think. Um, it might not hurt, but on the graduate level, right, I think it's really important to mention and have made contact with those people before and say, I would like to do work with so and so because when I read his book, it really influenced me and changed the way I perceived X.
Right.
So in that sense also, I think that's significant of understanding that the bridge between you and the university should become smaller and smaller, or shorter and shorter.
Right. Right. What are the most common mistakes that you've seen in applicant essays?
Hmm. Yeah, again, this reticence about talking about oneself. I've seen essays that I don't know what exactly they were about, but it wasn't the person I was working with. um,
You ever work
um,
with somebody whom you know before they came to you and you like, where are you in this essay?
Yeah, in some ways, those are kind of the hardest because I find because I'll say, I remember that time when you did X. Wouldn't that be helpful? And in some ways, having to me coming in as a blank slate to their lives sometimes really forces, I'm innocently asking questions. I'm not leading them anywhere. I just don't understand. And that pulls all sorts of things out of them, which I really like. Um, I'd say also, right, figuring out how to talk about oneself in a way that's not simply, personal interests or, getting kind of too casual, but, talk about yourself, but in the realm of X, you and biology, put them together. Don't, this isn't just about like your family dynamic. Why are you interested in this subject? Um, Also skipping important parts of one's story. Often, personal statements and applications want to see that the applicant is self-aware of their own development. Do you realize how you got from point A to point B? I think that's an implicit question in a lot of essay questions. And I think sometimes I've often had the experience of reading a draft and, asking them in a phone call afterwards, so I'm still a little confused. Like, how did you said that you like worked at Facebook and then you worked at this other place and like, was it just you decided to quit the first job and like for no reason? And then interesting stories come out about I transitioned because I got this interesting job offer and I only would have gotten it if I had done this project at my old job. And these narratives come out that I think that's the meat of the story. It's not really the list of again,
It's
that's what
not
the
the
rest.
resume in prose.
Right, right, exactly. It is really telling the story. um and again, also I would say not realizing sometimes specific professors to work with or specifying that you really see yourself in this program. Like, I think programs want to see, did you really look into us? Did you like our fancy name? Or did you ever look at the course listings? And I think if you can say, I know last fall this course on narrative and theory was offered and it looked really compelling to me, and using the knowledge that I have from reading X, Y, or Z, I think that I would be, I would really fit into a class like that and have something to contribute. So again, I think it's like you said, t- proving to the university that you fit there, that you are, the bridge is successfully built between you and the university.
Right. Any last words of advice for applicants?
It's a tough one. I would say always seek help, no matter how accomplished a writer you are. Everyone needs an editor. Editors have editors. There's no.
Yeah. I understand Winston Churchill didn't have editors, or edited very little of what he wrote, but there are very few Winston Churchills out there.
Yeah. I'm not buying it if someone tells me that they're the next Winston Churchill.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
My daughter actually is in London right now, and she just visited the Winston Churchill Museum.
Oh, that's neat.
Yeah, it was fascinating. Anyways, what do you wish I would have asked you? Anything that you would like to address that I haven't touched on here?
Well, I think I would just want to reiterate, just for a second, this aspect of persistence that I mentioned before.
Yeah.
I mean, not that persistence should turn into obsession, right? Again, the Harvard cap on only 3 times is clearly because people can do them. Not only is it a drag for the university, but right, this is very unhealthy to obsessively apply to one place. But I do think, not letting a rejection be a judgment of you, but really trying to learn that it was a judgment of an application. I think first and foremost, it could have been a judgment of other things. You can't undo a bad grade with an application. You can often, give good explanation or context or emphasize other things that could outweigh it. So in that sense, though, I would say, even if you get turned down from somewhere, I would go over with someone, what could my application have done better? Because those are skills you can take with you even when you apply for grants, when you apply for any kind of funding. I definitely see those skills transfer over when I myself apply for grants or funding or research funds. It's really the skills I've developed working with even university applications are very similar.
Right. Okay, so Rachel, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Listener, if you would like to learn more about Rachel Slutsky or benefit from her experience in grad school and grad and MBA admissions, perhaps have her help you with your application, we're going to link to her bio in the show notes at exhibit.com/32028, as well as to her contact page, and also some of the articles that she's written, both on graduate admissions and particularly on people separating from the military and applying to grad school. Listener, I want to thank you too for joining Rachel Slutsky and me for our 328th episode. If you find the show worthwhile, I have a suggestion for you. Subscribe. That way you don't miss any future shows, whether with admissions directors, test prep pros, consultants, or alumni doing great things. You can find subscribe links in the show notes at, you guessed it, exhibit.com/328. Thanks again for coming. This is Admission Straight Talk, and I am your host, Linda Abraham. I'll talk to you again next week.